Another edition of Transformational Astrology. We're going to be talking about what's going on in the sky and how that might affect you personally with this powerful new moon that's coming up in mid-Scorpio. And without further ado, let's go to the chart. There's a few other things we want to talk about today as well, since the election is just coming up around the corner too. So let's see. Let me get the chart up. Okay, you should be looking at the chart, which is geared not for the rising sign, but as we always do, it's geared for the Aries on the rising point, and then the actual rising on the west coast, which wouldn't apply where you are necessarily unless you are also on the west coast. It's actually 0 degrees of Sag on the west coast, which is kind of interesting. And so here we are with this new moon at the midpoint of Scorpio, the 15-degree mark of Scorpio, and that is a powerful degree. The midpoint of all the fixed signs is considered a powerful degree, so this is an especially powerful new moon just from that. And then we'll take a look at a couple of other things. This new moon doesn't have so much from the sun and moon, although it does trine Neptune. And that's important because we want to recognize also that Mercury is getting ready to retrograde. So Mercury is sitting here at 8 degrees of Sag, and it'll go another few degrees to 13, and then it'll turn around and start to retrograde all the way back to the beginning of Sag and then a little bit into Scorpio. That'll happen after the 16th. The 16th is the date. November 16th, that Mercury will turn retrograde and that also Venus will turn direct. So we get an interplanet retrograde all month, one way or the other. But what's interesting, and the reason I mentioned in the context of Neptune, is that when Mercury turns retrograde, it'll be at 13 degrees of Sag, and by George, that's where Neptune is at 13 degrees of another mutable sign, meaning that Mercury will square Neptune when it retrogrades, which I think will be very interesting. Now, this is not about the new moon, but this is about the week after, just a couple of days after exactly a week after, on the 16th of November, when we'll see also Venus station at the same degree 26. And that's very interesting also because I've left the new planets, Haumea and Makemake, in this description. I don't usually bring them in because they are so new, but they're actually in the same category as Pluto and as Eris. So they are probably important in charts, and I've been doing some research on that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But you can see that as Venus retrogrades, and we can advance this chart, and I'll show you that, it will be in close contact with Makemake. I'm sorry, this is Haumea. It'll be in close contact with Haumea for that period of time, which brings Haumea to the fore. So let's see, I don't think we want to talk about that right at the very beginning, although let's do that. Okay, so if I animate the chart forward till the 16th, that would be a week at a time. And here we are, we need one more day. So here's the 16th, and you can see, whoops, we want to go back to the 16th. It's kind of handy in TimePassages. You can move the planets around. I really love that feature when you're wanting to look ahead or look back. If it's just well, you can do it a year at a time. So it's good to see the movements and see how things line up. And what happens when Venus turns direct is it actually moves one more degree back to 25, but check this out, Haumea is at 25, so we really have a very close conjunction, not just on the 16th, but as you could see, all the way from the 7th to the 16th, and then beyond to the 22nd, these planets are within a degree of each other. And you know, we don't normally see Venus making a 1-degree aspect to an outer planet in the sky for more than a day or two, but because it's stationing on this degree, because it's slowing down to a stopping point because of the motion of the Earth being close to it, or as the Earth goes by, actually, and as Venus comes closer to the Earth in its orbit. Venus seems to move backwards, and that's been going on since October 5th. But now, on November 16th, we have Venus stationing direct. So this is kind of a big moment, especially for everybody that is involved in this Venus retrograde cycle for whatever reason. If you're a Libra, or if you're any cardinal sign, you might very well have aspects to this stationing Venus, which has been going through the last degrees of Libra ever since November 1st. So November 1st, yesterday, Venus actually made its heliacal rise, which was at the 29th degree of Libra. And it's very interesting that it got all the way back into Libra before it got far enough away from the sun so that we could see it as the morning star just before dawn. And the way that works is you can see, well, I'll put it back to where it was. So let's see, that would be revert. So here we are at the 7th again, which is the new moon. And in this timing, you can see there's about a 10 degree, well, actually it's about a 20 degree difference between, okay, let me back up. On the 1st, this is on the 7th, that's why we're not looking at today's chart. On the 1st, Venus backed up into the last degree of Libra, and then at that point, the sun was about 10 degrees away at 19 degrees of Scorpio. So that made it so that it was far enough ahead of the sun so that you could see it in the morning. You could see it rise. Of course, the sun wasn't at 19 then. I'm a little confused about that. But at that point, Venus was rising ahead of the sun at dawn. So you could, just before dawn, you could see Venus on the horizon, and Venus gets higher and higher on the horizon as time goes by, and it's called the morning star. And it's important in terms of the cycle of Venus with the sun, the synodic cycle, because for the next 584 days of Venus's journey with the sun and the pattern it makes in the sky with the sun, it will be considered to be a Libra Venus, which is what I've been trying to get to. So because it got to the last degree of Libra before it had its heliacal rise, it's a significant time because Venus hasn't been rising in Libra since the 1800s. So this is very interesting. We may be seeing a time of greater harmony between groups, and relationships are emphasized because Venus is in its own sign of relationship. So it's kind of an important time for Venus. And not only that, at this new moon, you can also see that Eris and Uranus are both in Aries, and this is also new. Uranus has just moved back from Taurus into Aries. Of course, it's mostly in Taurus now, but it's taking a little sojourn until January, back in its original sign that it was in for 7 years, which is Aries. And because it's moving backwards towards the position of Eris in the sky, we have an Eris-Uranus angle going on right now, similar to the conjunction that happened back in the summer of 2016 when the crazy election cycle took place that wound up putting Donald Trump in the White House, and there was surprise after surprise during that entire summer, including the surprise candidacy of Bernie Sanders, which surprised everybody on the Democratic side of things, and including Standing Rock was going on at that time also. I like to quote also the Women's March on Washington after the election as a manifestation of strong Eris, because Eris is a feminine warrior energy, and there's been a lot of that. There's been the Me Too movement. A lot of women are running for office right now. It's really a resurgence of a feminine intention to take some of the power back from the patriarchy, because we see that it's kind of running amok with the imbalance of the patriarchy. So what we see now with this Uranus moving backwards towards Eris, sitting there still at 23, is the midpoint of these, and you can easily eyeball it by just saying there's a 6-degree separation between these two planets. If we either subtract 3 or add 3, we get 26. 26 being exactly opposite where Venus is stationing in the sky right now during this new moon, and where also it's going to be exchanging places with Haumea, which is going to move forward into the 26-degree mark when Venus first retrogrades beyond that. So these two are together in the sky, and it's Haumea. And Haumea represents a way of really getting a profound spiritual connection to nature. My research has been on the principle that these are indigenous, named after indigenous gods and goddesses, Haumea and Makemake, and that they do represent, as many of the indigenous tribes all over the world have represented, a strong connection with nature. And that turns out to be the case. I've got example after example of where you can see strong Haumea in the chart, and there's some kind of connection to natural world or the spirituality of the natural world. And this is very important, especially since, as you can see, we have this very strong position in this new moon chart of the Uranus midpoint in exact opposition to this very long-standing Venus Haumea conjunction, which goes from now all the way through to the 22nd of the month, so the bulk of November. So I think we're going to get a hit of what this new planet Haumea has to offer us. And I believe that is recognizing how important nature is, recognizing how important issues of the earth. We know that the environmental issues are very important right now. And you could even say that this election coming up has something to do with that. And we'll talk about that in a little bit too, those issues being brought forward as the politics of the USA continue to evolve. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. We do have the Mercury retrograde coming up with Neptune, and we do have that this new moon is trine Neptune. And both of those are indications, because this new moon cycle will be during the rest of the 30 days of the month, when also Mercury retrogrades. We're going to have a lot of Neptune, and what is Neptune about? But recognizing that there is something beyond the physical, recognizing that similar to the iceberg that exists mostly underwater, we can only see part of what we are. We can only see the surface of who we are in this world. And Neptune is very good at bringing that other side into our consciousness in terms of music, poetry, art of all kinds. And it also can have a flavor of deception in terms of the real world. In other words, what we're doing here in terms of the physical is not very conducive with Neptune. And there is that side of Neptune which represents imagination, idealization, self-deception, possibly fantasy. It's in the natural 12th house of this chart, and in its own sign of Pisces. So with a strong Neptune, there is that to consider, that it's hard to detect what is reality, what is going on right now, who's got the truth. You know, we have different voices shouting what seems to be their truth, which maybe it is and maybe it isn't, but certainly what they're both shouting is contradictory to each other. So we don't know really what the truth is, and we have to kind of suss that out on our own. And actually, coming to our own values and being able to stand up for our own values is very important factor right now, as indicated by this powerful position of Eris in combination with Uranus, which is having a unique point of view, having a revolutionary perhaps point of view, progressive point of view. And we also have strong Saturn. You know, that's not to be ignored. It's still part of this mix. It's not as strong in this new moon configuration as it has been recently. But both Saturn and Uranus being powerful right now is represented by the conservative versus progressive attitudes that we see all around us. And this election is coming up. So I think that covers most of what I wanted to say about this new moon, except that I want to make sure to mention Chiron. Chiron, you know, just like Uranus has slipped back into Aries, Chiron has slipped back into Pisces and now occupies 28 degrees of Pisces. And actually, Jupiter is at 28 degrees going forward, though. Jupiter is at 28 degrees of Scorpio, so that's a trine. So that's a pretty strong position when you consider both Uranus and Jupiter are an aspect to Chiron in this chart. So with Chiron emphasized, this brings a couple of things to the fore. One is what I like to just call future shock, which is, of course, a term that was coined back in, I believe, the 70s, that things are moving so fast now, and it's so hard to tell what's going to happen next, that people do tend to get scared of what the consequences might be. They're scared of what the government might do next. They're scared of everything, immigration being a large section of the political fear that's being brought up, and makes people nervous that the composition of the racial complexion of the country might change. You know, there's people that are worried about that. There's people that embrace it. So anyway, that whole section of the fears, including fears of the pipe bombs that were being sent around, you know, there's a lot of national fear that's kind of emphasized in the headlines right now, including, of course, the mass shooting, let's not forget, which was horrible in Pittsburgh, which was deliberately anti-Semitic. Wipe out the Jews was this guy's motto, and we haven't seen that happen in this country on that scale for many, many years. Maybe it's the largest mass shooting intended to be an anti-Semitic act that's happened. So these are all terrifying, and these are all things that we have to worry about and wonder about. And individually, we also may feel that we can connect to our past fears and our past trauma with a strong Chiron. Chiron seems to represent how we were wounded in the past and how we might move beyond it. It's called the wounded healer. And the way that works is, you know, there's a tendency to bury the past. There's a tendency to not want to go there. In fact, there's even false memories, you know, people papering it over and not even remembering what happened to them as a small child, especially if it was very traumatic. And the solution is an odd one, because the solution is to go into that. The solution is to expose it and not to fear it, at least not to have a knee-jerk reaction to look away, because it's part of who we are. So if you are in a position where you feel inner wounding coming up, you know, as I say, there's a knee-jerk reaction to look away from that, and let's pretend that's not happening. But what's healthier and better for you is if you can dive into it. And it doesn't mean going to massive therapy. It doesn't mean cleansing for 3 hours every day. But it just means being a little bit more aware, paying attention, just watching those things. And when you see maybe there's a fear of social engagement, let's just say as an example, when you see that coming up, you say, oh, there's that fear of social engagement coming up again. I'm saying no to a picnic that I probably would enjoy. And you don't even have to change your decision. You just have to be aware of what's going on, and gradually it becomes more integrated. Gradually it becomes more of a wholeness, to where you say, well, that's me again doing that trauma reaction that I've had from the past, and that I've talked to a therapist about, and I know that's happening, and that just keeps coming up. And you don't ever really get over it. I love the Ram Dass line on that. He says you have these monsters that are inside you that can just take you over, but you don't have to you know, not that you don't have to, but you can't ever completely wipe that away. So these monsters become familiar to you, and they become like little schmooze that you can invite in for tea, he says. And basically you do make friends with your hidden angst and the dragon, they say, in the cave that guards the treasure, and then you're able to really access that compassion that's lying under that's just waiting to come out, and you do find a more integrated approach. So that's the recipe regarding Chiron, and I do think it's relevant right now because it's very strong in this coming up new moon coming up next Wednesday. So good, that's what I wanted to say about this chart, and I don't know if we want to take questions. Do we have a lot of them?
Just a few.
We have a few. Well, there is more that I want to talk about, because I want to talk about the transits to the USA chart. So what do you think we should do? Take questions first or go into that?
The first questions are about the US charts.
Okay, here's a question about the US chart, so let's go ahead and take that then.
Okay. The first question is from Pierre. He writes us from Montreal. Hello, Pierre. His question...
This is our eminent producer, Leslie Benson.
Yes, hello. His question, how do you read the 2020 conjunctions of Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto in Capricorn in the U.S. Foundation chart?
Okay, that's a good question. Yeah, just to mention the movement there, and I'll do it right here in this chart. Where do we have Pluto? Where do we have Saturn? Where do we have Jupiter? So Pluto is sitting in Capricorn. It has been for some time. And Saturn is sitting also in Capricorn and obviously moving more quickly than Pluto. So Saturn keeps moving along. We have the year of 2019 still to come. And then by January of 2020, Saturn will be conjuncting Pluto not very much further than it is now. It'll be around 23. I guess we can show you in the TimePassages software. There we go. So here is, as it turns out, November 2020. And you can see that in January it was Saturn actually conjuncted Pluto, and now Pluto has moved further. And we have a triple conjunction happening by November with, I don't know if I mentioned Jupiter by mistake. I was talking about Pluto and I was talking about Saturn, and then Jupiter has come up to join this triple conjunction, making a triple conjunction of Saturn, Pluto, and Jupiter, and then they go on to conjunct, that is to say Saturn and Jupiter, the faster moving of these planets, go on to conjunct at the 0 degree mark of Aquarius. And that is very interesting because this will be the first conjunction in Aquarius for quite some time, the first conjunction in an air sign, and this is the beginning of a series of Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions in air signs. And there was one sometime back in 1980, but that was like an anomaly, and most of them have been in Earth until now. So this is the first air sign, and maybe it's a signal for the age of Aquarius to commence. In any case, astrologers do feel that this is a very powerful time. And if you'll notice, we have we have Pluto almost at 23 degrees of Capricorn, and where is Eris? Eris has moved back to 23 degrees. It just doesn't move very fast. It takes about it moves about a quarter of a degree per year in Aries. The whole cycle of Eris is 556 years, so that it takes a lot longer through Aries than any other sign because that's the furthest point of its orbit. It's an elliptical orbit. It was found at the furthest point away, so that's why it took so long to find it. It's actually brighter and more massive and just about the same size as Pluto, but it wasn't discovered in the 1900s because it's so far away. It took until the techniques improved in the 21st century before Eris could be discovered. But it is kind of a twin to Pluto in the Kuiper Belt, so that's why I believe it's so important. And here in this configuration, it's making a square alignment with Pluto. In fact, on the 21st, which you can go, let's go one more month here, and then let's go another week or two. So on the 21st of December is when we have this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction at 0 degrees of Aquarius, and we have Pluto at 23, and also we have a perfect square, the same degree alignment, and even Mars gets into the act at 23 degrees of Aries. So this is a very powerful time, and everybody's been talking about the transition, the societal transition of 2020. Now, if we were to look at the USA chart, we would see, and this is a transit that we won't want to look at for a minute or two here. So in the natal, or the radical chart of the USA, we do have Pluto at 27 degrees of Capricorn. So the 23 degree mark is where Pluto will get to by the time that we do December 21st of 2020. And therefore, we're getting very close to the Pluto return of the United States. An individual obviously cannot have a Pluto return, which is about 248 years. But like the Saturn return, it is an important element in the nation's chart, and it does indicate transformation, as did, for that matter, the transit of Pluto across the ascendant of the USA chart, which happened at 9/11. So at 9/11, Pluto and Saturn were opposite each other, and now they're coming to their conjunction. The opposition in 2001 was right across the ascendant-descendant of the US chart, And I use a chart. This is a variation of the Sibley chart that I use. 5:10 p.m. is the Sibley chart. This is 5:13 and 55 seconds because it was rectified by Dane Rudhyar to this particular time, and I just use the Dane Rudhyar rectification because I'm so in admiration of him as a proponent of humanistic astrology so many years ago, right? Also in the 30s, he wrote the Astrology of Personality, I believe it was called, which is his seminal book. So I use the Dane Rudhyar rectification, which he published in a book called The Astrology of America's Destiny. And he talked about this chart and how it really represented very, very clearly. And then when not the USA, and then when we had the opposition of Pluto and Saturn right across the ascendant-descendant of this chart, and it was 9/11, and that was signaling a massive transformation in America where really we had just a huge outpouring of sympathy for the victims of 9/11, and the sympathy, the whole world was with us at that time. Maybe not so much lately, but at that time. And it was really the beginning of Pluto moving into the first house of this chart, which I think was very fascinating because it is the transformation of this country by moving into the first house. Well, let's take a look at the transits to the U.S. chart for right now. So if we go to the transit date and we say now, well, no, we want the 7th, don't we? So we want the new moon. And this is approximately the new moon. This is actually some hours past the new moon because it went all the way to 10 p.m., so okay. We want to edit the transit date. Here we go. And maybe more AM, I guess, huh? So there we have close to the new moon point of view. And remember that the previous new moon was at 15 degrees of Libra. And that was October 8th, I believe. So at that time, what we were doing was we were having a new moon, what was happening in this chart, I should say. We were having a new moon right on the Saturn of the chart. You can kind of see it hidden behind these lines here. I like to draw the aspect lines direct to the outer planets, so it's the transiting planets, I mean, so that it's easier to see the outer wheel, so that it's easier to see those lines. But here is where Saturn resides at 14 degrees of Libra, and here's where the Sun in the U.S. chart is about 13 degrees of Cancer, so that's a square. So we have a very powerful executive in this country, which is indicated by the 10th house placement of Saturn. And so that's one thing. The study of this chart is will richly repay you. And so we have that understanding that there's a strong executive, and we have a new moon hitting that Saturn. So this past month has been a lot about the strength of the executive and what he can do or can't do. And he's, as you know, Donald Trump has been doing various things, sending troops to the border to stop immigration influx, and changing the Constitution. He wants to change the law that says that if you're born in the USA, even if your parents are undocumented, you're a U.S. citizen. That's in the 14th Amendment, I believe it is. Anyway, so he's after that, changing that. So now what do we have? We have just the day after the election, we have the 15-degree mark of not Libra but Scorpio. So therefore, it still hits Saturn. And what about? I was wondering, since Saturn is being hit so strongly, and since we've been having a Saturn-Uranus connection in the sky quite a bit lately, the question comes up, what is happening with Uranus in this chart? And you can see that actually this 25-degree mark is also a significant point. Now remember that this is the 26-degree mark here of Aries, which is the midpoint of Eris and Uranus in the sky moving backwards into Aries. So this is strong. And what does it hit in the U.S. chart? But the Mercury in the U.S. chart was at 24 degrees of Cancer, so that makes a perfect square. We have as well Mars at 25 degrees of Aquarius in this new moon chart, which I didn't mention it, but it also hits that retrograde Venus, which is at 26 or 25, and it's going to station at 25. And we also have Haumea at 25, which becomes 26. So this is all kind of tied in together, the opposition between the Uranus and the Eris at 26 degrees, and it ties in with this Haumea Venus, stationing Venus in the 10th house of the U.S. chart, makes an opposition, and it's a T-square to actually the 7th house ruler, which is Mercury. Mercury also rules communication. So we might think of this as a very stressful time in the United States in terms of communication, and of course everybody is very strident right now communicating their particular side of this polarization that we've been seeing. And one hope is that with this new Libra Venus, that we might be able to see more diplomacy, we might be able to see more compromise, we might be able to see more partnering between the various factions, and so maybe we can get something done instead of both sides kind of screaming at each other, which is what's going on right now. The fact that it hits the 7th house cusp of the U.S. chart is also quite interesting, because this is how we relate to the rest of the world. So all of this that's happening in the U.S. right now, and it does refer back, well, the election is the day before this hits. So we're technically still in the Saturn cycle, that is to say the Libra cycle, which was 15 degrees Libra until this date, which is the day after the election, and that is on the Saturn of the U.S. chart. So you know, I can't come down on either side. I don't know if people expect me to. Mars is also on the Moon, which represents the public in this chart. So it's a very, I think the main message that I have to convey is that this is a very powerful time for the United States, which has been obvious. You don't need an astrologer to tell you that. I mean, the newspaper headlines are screaming at it every day. This is one of the most important midterm elections ever. A lot of things are on the line. Do we continue on this Republican-controlled Congress with a Republican president and therefore a lack of balance, or do we balance by having a Democratic-controlled Congress, which is a possibility out of this election? The Democrats are very assiduously trying to take back control of both houses of Congress. It's a toss-up. I don't think anybody knows which way it's headed in terms of political punditry. I've heard astrologers come down on both sides of this as well. But anyway, what I have to say is just that this is such an intense time and a powerful time, and Eris is involved. Even the Eris in the U.S. chart at 8 degrees is involved, because all summer long we've had a strong, well, not all summer, but there was a full moon right on the U.S. Eris back in the end of June, which is when the Supreme Court decision became a big decision. You know, who's going to be, are we going to confirm the justice that the president appointed, or are we going to not confirm? You know, that was a big battle at that time. So I just think it's a time with Eris, you know, it's a time for everybody to stand up and be counted. And what could be more exactly the message of both political parties right now is that everybody must stand up and be counted. And I believe it's true. I mean, I don't think that's just empty sentiment. I think that the only way to get away from the power of politics is to be very clear in your own mind where you stand, what your values are, and then articulate those values. Fight in some way for those values. Do what you can to make yourself heard and felt and seen to whatever extent is appropriate. I mean, you know, you don't want to be rabid about it. You don't want to go shouting at everybody. You don't want to, you know, you have to take into account other people's point of view and try to work with them. But still, articulating your own values, standing up for what you believe inside is so important right now, and it's really reflected in the zeitgeist as well as in the planets, especially these new planets, Haumea and Eris, that are beyond Pluto. So it's very, very interesting right now, and like I say, I'm not trying to predict. I have no idea how it's going to work out, except that it does need to be worked out. You know, we actually, I can very firmly state that we need to have more of a dialogue. We need to have more bipartisanship and kind of ease back on the partisanship that we've seen up until now. So that's my message there. And then to answer the question, which was originally asked about the USA chart, yes, this is a very powerful time. The conjunction that's coming up at the 23-degree mark, which is where Pluto will be, of Capricorn, and it'll be a few degrees before that as well, with the triple conjunction in November of 2020 with Jupiter and Saturn. It does come into the second house, which is where we stand, where we have our values, how we can do our finances and our resources. I mean, one connection with this is you could say it's kind of an indication that the financial picture will change, because we do have a triple conjunction, including Saturn, the ruler of the second house, on the second house cusp of this chart, indicating that there's possibly some big changes coming down. Could be another recession, could be another way of doing business, could be Bitcoin coming in, which is quite a different way of doing finance. But, you know, I'm not a very good political analyst as far as being able to say we know for sure that there's a financial meltdown coming, as some people have said. But there's changes coming, that I can say for sure. And it is a big watershed moment in the society right now, leading up to 2020. So I think everybody between now and 2020 has to be aware that this important time is coming, and what do we do about it, and how do we act upon it. So that's my message for that. And we can take a few more questions before we close. I'll bring back the original chart we had up, which is the chart of the new moon coming up. And I'll do that by going to the revert. So here we have 8:02 a.m. on November 7th, the day after the election. Back to a more peaceful way of looking at things.
Okay, great. Our next question comes from Dorothy. She asks, the Scorpio region of the chart has been pretty active lately, with Jupiter, Mercury, and Venus retrograde there. What can we expect when Venus finally goes direct and hits the degree of the new moon, 15 Scorpio 11? What might it activate? Is there any significance in the fact that the new moon is mid-Scorpio, 15 degrees?
Definitely there's a significance to the mid-Scorpio degree mark, because that is a powerful, the 15-degree mark, as I said before, is actually considered a very powerful degree mark. And when we think about Scorpio, we think about depth, and we think about change. We think about getting to the heart of the matter. We think about how can we really understand the full impact of what's going on in terms of not just the surface of events, but in terms of inner motivation. How can we understand relationship with so much Venus in terms of not only how we're getting along with our partner, or how we're attempting to connect with somebody if we want to form a partnership, but also thinking about what goes on at depth. And this brings Chiron back into it too, because really oftentimes, and Chiron of course is not in Scorpio, but it is in Pisces, which is again an emotional connection to inner work, you know, what's going on deep inside ourselves, what you could think of as other dimensionality, Pisces, you know, as far as, or Neptune as well, as far as recognizing that there's more. It's like transpersonal, you know, understanding that there's more going on than even we can recognize with our conscious minds. There's stuff below the level of consciousness, hidden areas of our psyche that really come into play with relationship. And, you know, it's very interesting that when Jupiter entered Scorpio is when the Me Too movement began. So it's something to think about, that we are, as a culture and also as individuals, looking really under the covers of what goes on in relationship. And I think that's very important to recognize. Now, the other question, the other part of that question, which was what happens when Venus gets to the mid-degree of Scorpio? Well, of course, one thing is, yes, Venus is in Libra, and this is a Libra cycle of Venus, as began with the first 584 days of Venus, the next 584 days of Venus. But even in spite of the fact that it's a Libra time for the Venus energy, and we can think of her as a goddess of love and harmony and connection at this point, there is also, and it's coming off of an Aries cycle of Venus, which was the 584 days preceding this, which was a very active time for femininity. We must recognize a very active, and of course that reflects back on Eris too, being the feminine warrior. But as we're coming into what we hope will be a more peaceful time, a more harmonious time of connection, we do have to recognize that Venus will be going through Scorpio. Now, were this to have been an eclipse on the 15-degree mark of Scorpio, not just a new moon, but a new moon eclipse, closer to the nodal axis, then we would have a different attitude about it. An eclipse degree is a marker degree, and if Venus came to that marker degree, the marker degree that we do have going is 18 degrees of Leo. So, you know, maybe when it comes to 18 degrees of Scorpio, squaring that point, that might be a more significant point than coming to just the new moon degree. It won't actually hit the new moon, I don't think, until after December. We can take a quick look at that, actually. So if I go a month ahead, we have Venus at just 2 degrees of Scorpio, you see, and December we're winding up the old cycle and starting with the new cycle, and it's going to be a little bit further than 15, like 16 degrees or 17 degrees of Sag. So we won't be in the same cycle when here we are again at the 7th of November. We won't actually be, we'll be in the Sag new moon cycle by the time Venus gets to, I don't think the 15-degree mark is going to be particularly important. Like I say, the 18-degree mark might be more important because that's when it does hit the original degree of that eclipse last summer, which was at 18 degrees of Leo. Okay.
Awesome, thank you. The next question that we have is from Aaron, asking, what does it mean when the lunar nodes in the natal chart are direct? I thought they always moved in retrograde motion.
Oh, okay, well, there's such a thing as the true node, and there's the mean node. The mean node is, a lot of people swear by the mean node, and that just means let's average the motion of the nodes, because in point of fact, if you really look at the way the orbit of the moon aligns with the orbit of the sun, or of the Earth around the sun, which from a geocentric standpoint seems to be the sun's orbit in the sky, that defines what's called the plane of the ecliptic, and the nodes are actually as the orbit of the moon around the Earth, which is its own plane, interacts with the plane of the ecliptic. You have the nodal points, which is the ascending node and the descending node, as that plane rises above the plane of the ecliptic and as that plane descends below the plane of the ecliptic. But that doesn't move in a strictly retrograde motion. The true node, it's called, moves a little bit forward, sometimes a little bit forward, sometimes a little bit back. On an average, it moves backwards. So the mean node always moves in retrograde, but the true node moves both direct and retrograde. Oh, and then your question might be, well, which do you use? Is the true node more important or is the mean node more? A lot of astrologers work with the mean node as being in TimePassages software, we actually have an option. You can choose either the mean node or the true node. I prefer the true node because I believe that it's actually reflecting in the moment where the node is and the motion of the nodes. But either way it can be done, and they mean the same thing in either case. It's not like the meaning changes when you're working with a true node. It's all about, you know, the north node is where you're headed in your life. The south node refers back to the past, maybe past lives. And that would be the same interpretation whether true or mean node is used.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Mary. She knows you. She says, some years ago, someone showed me a paperback pocket-sized book that one would use to rectify a birth time. It showed every few minutes a personality difference. It might be a Sabian symbols book, but I do not know the author. Any chance you might know what book I am talking about or one like it?
Yeah, I like to rectify a chart by Uranus to the angles, but that's a topic for a longer talk. But yeah, I don't know that particular book. Of course, rectification is very interesting art. It is really an art form. You do it by knowing the past. You do it by knowing when important events happened in the past, and when you know that, you can actually make some very shrewd deductions about, especially if you have an approximate birth time. It's very good to rectify slightly. Oh, and that's all the questions we have. Okay. Well, good. I think this was good. Good amount of time that we wanted to spend on it, and I'm glad we had a few questions. And let me go ahead and come back to the other view. And let's see, what do I want to say in summary? I do want to mention that the standard edition of Time Passages is on sale just for a few days. We decided to do a flash sale. Maybe tell me when that ends.
Saturday at midnight.
Oh, Saturday, that's right. Saturday at midnight. So there's a chance to get a 25% off, which is kind of strong discount. And we do want to make it very available to people. And we have all these relationship reports also on sale now, and you need the standard edition of Time Passages to put those in. So it kind of goes with the existing relationship add-on sale. And those are just very, very fine interpretations for both the synastry between two charts and the composite chart. We have both of those available as different add-ons. And the relationship insights combines those two. It's the total of those two, or having both of those. So anyway, that's one little piece of announcement.
Can I add something to that, Henry?
Oh, yeah, sure.
In order to get the 25% discount for the standard edition, there's a coupon code Venus Rise. That's VENUSRISE. And I will put the link to that and the coupon code in the comments here.
Oh, good. All right, so that's a way you can get 25% off on the standard edition, which is kind of the flagship edition, although the advanced edition has many additional features, but you can always upgrade from the standard to the advanced for the difference in price. So that's a very nice thing. You can always make that decision later if you're trying to hesitate between those two. I sincerely say that the Time Passages software is just a great way to learn more about astrology. There's a lot of interpretations that come with it, both transiting and natal. And it's a very rich set of information there to be helpful. So let's see, and to be able to understand your own chart, because that's really the task, isn't it? Know thyself, right? Understand who you are and what you're up to. And that's a big part of understanding where you're headed and where you fit in and how you can just be okay, because like I said earlier, and I think it's really important, no matter what happens, if you have a firm grasp on your own set of values and where you make your stand and where you can articulate those successfully and feel, successfully in terms of the fact that it makes that important chime with what you really, really deep down believe, when you can discover that and act from that, nothing can really harm you. Let's see. So yeah, I think it is that really is a good segue. That really is what's the key of this time. I think it's so important to really stand up and be counted. I think it's really important to go out and vote, no matter which side you're on. Just articulate that vision by at least putting your vote down where it counts, and try to act upon your deepest values. That's really what it's all about right now. And we'll see. It'll be interesting these next 2 weeks. We'll really see what Haumea is all about, because that archetype is going to be coming into our consciousness very clearly with this dance it's doing within 1 degree of Venus for that entire period of time. So I think it's going to be a very powerful time in terms of Earth issues. I don't know how that'll come up. Maybe to some extent this election might be a referendum on Earth issues. Certainly there's a difference in the partisanship expressed by the executive branch, by Donald Trump, versus what the rest of the world and many, many people, the majority of Americans, seem to think about what's important as far as curbing greenhouse gases and so on, which, to save the planet, the planet is really in a bad way, as according to the current science, unless there can be extreme breakthroughs in carbon sequestering, that is a problem, a potential problem. So I think it's a powerful election time, and I think it's time to stand up and be counted, like I say, depending on what you most deeply believe. So get out there and vote. That's the message. One message. And be well until the next time we talk. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.